you go. Ottomans are supporting the Kurds in border skirmishes. Okay. Ottomans amassing artillery in the border area. Kurds are allied with them. There you go. Volume 3, number 19, 1909, page 235. Anzal, Northern District under Ottoman Turkish control. Ottoman Turkish army present in Urmia and environs. Kurds in occupation of Sir and Sagas live off of the villages. Kurds are targeting Balulan. They plundered several villages, so they kept doing this. Two more girls are abducted. Urmia landlords are attracting pro-Ottoman Kurds to settle the abandoned villages in Upper Nazlu and Shahab rivers. Local Turkish and Assyrian peasants worried. So they had a lot of problem with these Kurds. And then team up with the Ottomans and do it, right? Ottomans, backed by the Kurds, have occupied Kariz, Golunji and Jamalabad, northern village. As new landlords, they have been extracting heavy tribute from the villagers for 3 years. Reports of pillage diminished at the end of the year 1911. The Russian military presence and a more vigorous defence of the borders provided rural areas with a measure of safety. The inhabitants of some villages who had been displaced in previous years returned back. Among them were some Tagava villagers who were scattered as refugees since the 1907 Turkish attacks. Of the 94 families from Balulan, 20 resettled their former homes, not knowing that worse was awaiting them shortly after. In 1912 to 1914, the era of prosperity. After Russia established its mission station in Urmia, 1898, Armenians and Assyrians began to purchase the fields around it and build luxury homes. Urban development in this area continued and took momentum in the years 1912 to 1914. Well-to-do Assyrians began to purchase land and build new homes for their own occupation or as rental property to Russian families, consular or military personnel. Dalgosha, heart refreshing, became the new Christian quarter in Urmia and so forth. Okay, so they're doing quite well there. If it were not for the World War I uprooting, a sizable part of Urmia region would have become liberated from the oppressive control of absentee feudal overlords and would be owned by freeholding farmers. Okay, American-style advertising appeared on the pages of Kokova beginning in 1912. Consumerism was taking hold among the population. Assyrians were opening stores in the caravan, Sarai or Middle Eastern style shopping malls. So doing okay. It says news of prosperity in Urmia spread to the other Assyrian communities. The year of bondage. Assyrians call the year of 1915 the year of bondage because it was in the winter of 1915, following the Russian army retreat from Urmia, that Turkish forces, together with the Kurdish allies, teaming up with them again, and local Azari Turkish supporters of opportunists, descended upon the Assyrian and Armenian villages. The Turkish and Kurdish forces occupied Urmia for 5 months on 18 weeks from January 2, 1915 until May 24, 1915. A detailed history of the Holocaust that followed has been recorded in various sources and will not be repeated in this paper. Only less known facts will be recorded here. The Christian villages annihilated during the 16-week occupation were, it's all there. In 1917, after a Russian contingent had returned to Urmia and the Turks had retreated, the American mission under the direction of Dr. Shedd sent agents to the Urmian plain to enumerate the surviving Christians and classify them for purposes of food rations. These estimates are regarded as the most accurate. Okay, some information there on the Assyrians. The first Holocaust was to be followed by a second one in the summer of 1918, when the civilian population was left unprotected again. This time the entire Christian population, including the Armenians, fled south to join the British forces in Sainkala, from where they were taken to Bakuba refugee camps. On the eve of World War I, all the mission stations in Urmia had packed and left except for the American and French. The French mission was attacked and burnt down, and all the refugees as well as the clergy were massacred. The American missionaries risked their lives taking care of 15,000 traumatized and starving refugees who had taken shelter in their headquarters. The Assyrians, who survived the Holocaust, attest to the fact that without the presence of the American mission, not one Assyrian would have been spared during World War I. Yeah, they would have killed them all. After a period of hiding, Kochova began publication in March of 1917. The lead article says, "The little Kochova star bows down to the ground before the American and French missionaries who selfishly endangered their own lives and purchased this nation at a price beyond monetary calculations." In spite of the unspeakable atrocities, there were pockets of Christian and Muslim neighbours who protected one another during those dark days. Although at that time the Assyrians were themselves living on rations, in one report we read that a group of women collected some food and clothing and carried it to the Kurdish refugees in towns. They had made small bags of raisins especially for the children, so they cared for everybody. You know? Okay, these guys are attacking them, giving them crap, these Kurdish, their forces, whatever, but they were kind enough to go and give these Kurdish refugees small bags of raisins for the kids, you know. The Syrians, Russians and the British during the World War I years, the Assyrians were exposed to two different foreign powers as the allies and protectors, the Russian and the British. But the Assyrian experience is very different concerning these two protecting forces. The Russians are portrayed in Assyrian war annals, personal diaries and memories of as human, friendly and compassionate. The British, on the other hand, are described as aloof, haughty and exploitative. The Assyrian experience with the Russian forces took place during the first flight in the winter of 1915, when 10,000 Assyrians from the villages near the Russian border followed the Russian retreating forces. Here is one of the eyewitness accounts. Female respondent. Okay, they took off. We followed the Russians. They fled Iran. Another one says they fled Iran. A Russian Kazakh dismounted and put me on his horse. He helped my mother to her feet. He carried me on his horse for the rest of the time. On the way, my mother found a 10-month-old baby left on the snow. She picked him up and brought him along for the child she had left behind. Now he is a physician in Chicago. Wow. At that time, the Assyrians came into contact with the British after the 1918 flight from Urmia. The following are a few eyewitness accounts. In her family history, Miriam Yohanan describes an episode that is worth noting. Her immediate family, who included her husband and their 3 small children, were among the refugees that fled from Urmia to Hamadan in the summer of 1918. Her husband, Dr. David Yohanan, a well-known physician educated in the USA, fell ill in Bija before reaching Hamadan, so they were unable to continue their trek. The British had a strong garrison in Bija. When he requested medication from the British physicians, they refused on the ground that their medical supplies were for the use of the British Army. As his illness got worse, his wife repeatedly pleaded for medication or transportation elsewhere, but the British physicians and officers refused to provide them with either medication or transportation, knowing full well that he would die if not helped. Other refugees report that when they reached Hamadan, They were half starved and emaciated from the horrible days they had passed fleeing for their lives with the enemy in pursuit. Yet as soon as they arrived in Hamadan, the British lost no time in using them as labour force. The men and youth were enlisted for military duty, and women were consigned to break rocks and sew sacks for the British road construction project, which was to connect Hamadan to Baghdad. In his own words, a male respondent mentioned, "We walked the distance to Hamadan under very difficult circumstances. I have stayed without food for more than 3 days. When we reached Hamadan, I was walking in the bazaar. The British apprehended me and said that I had to enlist in the army. I was 16 then. They took us to a village. It was very cold and we were without food or clothing. There were about 2,000 to 3,000 of us aged 16 to 25. After a few weeks I deserted and ran away. The British there were not able to get provisions. They were giving us a kind of bread that looked like manure. It was inedible." Okay, the role of Germany in the Assyrian Holocaust. The generation of Assyrians born after World War I was heavily oriented in literature that emphasised the British betrayal of the Assyrians. While there is ample documentation to validate that perspective, the role of Germany in instigating the Holocaust was obscured until Gabrielle Yonan came up with her groundbreaking research. She revealed the German documents attesting to the fact that jihad, the holy war, was actually made in Germany. In other words, it was under German instigation that Turkey made the jihad an excuse to wipe out thousands of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks in Turkey, and to attack a neutral country like Persia. If the role of Germany was lost to the post-war generation of the Assyrians, it was not to the Assyrians of the World War I generation. Although there is no explicit reference in the Assyrian sources to the role of Germany in instigating the jihad, there is clear documentation of German support of it. Even before the occupation of the region by the Turks, Kokofa noted that the Kurds, backed by the Turks, were no longer raiding the border villages to plunder, but to massacre, and that Germany, as a Turkish ally, was permitting the Holocaust. In this massacre, civilians in France as well. In the massacre, civilians in France as well. There were reports that Germans were shipping truckloads of dead soldiers, including their own, to special factory sites where the cadavers were processed into different types of lubricants. What the hell? That the Germans had sent their generals and officers to train the Turkish army was interpreted as an outright colonisation act. Surveying foreign newspapers, Kokofa reported, "Now the real Turkish ruler is not the Sultan, but Germany, which, like the British did in India, aims at controlling the government by controlling the army." In her book The Assyrian Holocaust, Gabrielle Yonan makes the interesting remark that the Holocaust that the Assyrians, Armenians and the Greeks experienced is different from the Jewish Holocaust. The difference is that the Assyrians, and for that matter the Christians, had a choice. Had they agreed to convert to Islam, they would have been spared. Obviously, based on the following comment by Reverend Justin Perkins, who first met the Assyrians of Urmia in 1836, the Assyrians were ready to pay the dearest price for their Christianity. American Christians know nothing in comparison with the Nestorians of suffering for the name of the Lord Jesus. They are habitually called by their superiors the Mohammedans, unclean. They are habitually called by their superiors the Mohammedans, or Islam, unclean infidels and dogs, and are treated in accordance with those epithets. Often, their properties and sometimes children are wantonly stripped from them on account of their attachment to Christianity, while their renouncement of it would place them at once beyond the reach of such indignities and sufferings. In 1913, in a war report on Takahuma, Kokofa writes, "Of the 9 who were killed, 3 died a martyr's death. One was asked to deny Christ and accept Muhammad. 'I am fasting and cannot deny my Lord,' he said. A second was killed for scorning the suggestion. A woman was shot for professing Jesus Christ." Similar scenes are recorded in various other accounts. Undoubtedly, some Assyrians did renounce their religion to spare their life and that of their family, but those who did not and survived the genocide are the ones that to this day have maintained their religion, their name, and their cultural heritage. Consequences of the World War I genocide on the Assyrians. During World War I, the Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks in Ottoman territory were all victims of state-sponsored horrendous acts of barbarism on the part of Turks and Kurds. But the case of Assyrians is of special concern because the genocide has had irrevocable and far-reaching effects on the present situation and the future fate of this ethnic group. Let us examine some of the consequences of the genocide on the Assyrians. Close to 2/3 of the Assyrian nation perished during World War I. Uprooting among those especially targeted were the intellectual and political elite of the nation. Unlike the Armenian and the Greek refugees who were assisted by their nationals when they were in refugee camps and could rejoin fellow citizens in Armenia and Greece, the Assyrians were uprooted with no chance of repatriation, except for the Assyrian remaining of Iran. Despite vigorous pleas on the part of the Assyrian representatives, the entente powers or the United Nations did not grant the Assyrians even a settlement with some local autonomy. The traditional political organization of the Assyrians, which until World War I had maintained the institutional continuity of the nation, was so completely shattered that an effective alternative organization has not been achieved. Given the geographically dispersed condition of the communities in diaspora, the reason is the above mentioned blows snowballed into a chain of adverse effects. The pillage and confiscation of all the economic assets during the Holocaust threw the nation into total bankruptcy. Since then, no national recovery in the form of establishment of a national fund has been possible. The Assyrians are still building their financial base one family at a time. So they basically pooped on them. The British pooped on them. Everybody pooped on them. Right? Then while the Armenians and the Greeks have maintained or attained statehood and are slowly recovering from the worst effects of the genocide, although there can be no recovery from human loss, especially on a personal level, the Assyrians remain destabilized. Through a heroic effort and sheer determination, the destitute Assyrian refugees of World War I who found shelter in various countries throughout Europe and the Americas have everywhere established socially and economically viable families. Today, through collaboration with the Armenians and Greeks, they are renewing their efforts to set the historical record straight regarding their plight and their rights as a nation. Let us hope that the Armenians and Greeks will give equal recognition to the Assyrian cause in this collaborative effort. Okay, some footnotes here. So that newspaper, that cover, revealed a lot of information about what was actually going on in that era. So that's the history of Armenia and Iran. How much they've suffered. I've actually got a video. I made a video on the history of the Assyrian church with the Nestorians and how they've been persecuted for over 18th century, something like that. How much crap they went through, they've gone through, but they still cling to their faith in Jesus Christ, or Yeshua Mashiach, Isho Mashiach, the Messiah. And they still were, compassionate, kind, helpful to other people that were suffering and stuff like that. They always had that faith, that strong faith, which would be a great be a great inspiring story about faith, to the Christians out there. That no matter what, stand strong. Stand by your faith. No matter what you go through, what you got to put up with, and still show compassion and kindness and love to other people, right? That are in need or suffering, and so forth. Well, they did. They had 18th centuries of crap, and they, stood on their faith for 18 centuries, no matter what happened to them. Okay, so hopefully that's interesting to you. It's quite lengthy, but that's basically us pointing out that at the Ministry of the Real Truth, that the roots of Christianity, that all came from the ancient Aramaic, Assyrian Aramaic, Kitab Ashret, from these people, okay, the Suraya, the Brita in Aramaic, or Genesis in English. We saw the sacred old scribal tongue of the Old Testament scribes and prophets, the Lishana Atika or Lishana Supraya of the Assyrian Aramaic or Kitab Ashret, coming from which involved what's his name, Abraham, the patriarch, who wasn't a Hebrew. He was born in Ur of Chaldea, which is in Mesopotamia, which is of Assyria. And no, he wasn't a Hebrew or an Israelite, but later on, if you look at the Genesis genealogy list, right, he may have come in contact with Heber, or Heber, Heber, the supposed forefather of the Hebrews, because he was told to come out of his land by God and go into the land of Canaan, and then the Israelites didn't really come about until Jacob had his name changed by God to Israel, and then he had descendants, right? He had sons, and then they had sons and daughters, etc. They had descendants who had descendants, and they became the Israelites, people of Israel, the Israelites, of the house of Israel. So there's some historical fact, some real truth for you. Go and study it yourself and do your own personal research to verify everything said in this video and the article as true. Find a older Assyrian, native born Mesopotamian or Syrian, that can verify to you that it's all historical fact, what's been presented via the Kokva newspaper of that period.